50 BC, Julius Caesar's legions marched through northern Gaul, besieging tribal fortresses nestled among hills and forests. Before them, the barbarian tribes watched with a mix of scorn and amazement as the Romans erect colossal structures, siege towers, temporary walls, and fortified camps. But amid the chaos of war, a recurring thought begins to take shape. The Romans were small. The Gauls, by contrast, appeared enormous, not just taller, but stronger, wilder, almost superhuman. Roman chronicles claim that the peoples of the north, from Gaul to Britannia, stood out for their imposing stature. Even the women were described as robust and fearsome. Ancient authors spoke of barbarian leaders whose mere presence inspired terror, reinforcing an image of northern giants that would endure for centuries. But how much of that was actually true? Today, we're going to unearth the truth, literally, through ancient bones, exaggerated chronicles, and nutritional realities. We'll discover whether the barbarians were truly as tall as we've been led to believe, or if it was all part of myth that grew larger than the people themselves. To the Romans, the northern peoples were a constant source of both fascination and fear. In chronicles, letters, and campaign accounts, descriptions abound of enemies who seemed to come from another world. Men with fair hair, fierce eyes, and most of all, great height. Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, repeatedly emphasized the contrast between his disciplined legions and the fierce Gallic and Germanic warriors. Though not always explicit, his descriptions consistently suggest a physical difference. Barbarians were perceived as more robust, more vigorous, and yes, taller. The historian Tacitus, in his work Germania, offers an even more detailed picture of the Germanic tribes. According to him, the Germans were physically striking, with powerful bodies and notable stature. Their harsh, rural lifestyle, centered around hunting and warfare, seemed to produce tougher men than the urbanized Romans accustomed to comfort and routine. The Britons were also seen as particularly imposing. One of the most famous examples is Boudica, queen of the Iceni, who led a brutal rebellion against Roman rule in Britain. Roman texts portray her as a fearsome figure with a commanding presence and a powerful voice. Her red hair and tall frame helped turn her into an icon of the other, barbaric, wild, and terrifying. But perhaps the most interesting thing about these sources isn't just the physical descriptions themselves, but how they reinforced a broader narrative. To the Roman mind, they weren't just fighting military enemies. They were confronting beings that felt almost mythical, representatives of a primitive, chaotic world that threatened the order Rome sought to impose. In many ways, barbarians were portrayed as the opposite of the Roman ideal. If the perfect citizen was restrained, disciplined, and self-controlled, the barbarian was emotional, wild, explosive, and physically overwhelming. This perception didn't just feed fear, it also fueled propaganda. Depicting the empire's enemies as towering figures made Roman victories seem even more glorious. However, over time, some began to suspect that this image might have been a little exaggerated. Exaggeration was common in ancient historiography, and while many of these northern peoples were indeed taller than the average Roman, it's very likely that the writers amplified these details for dramatic effect. After all, what better way to highlight Roman bravery than by portraying them as conquerors of giants? Roman sources, though valuable, must be read with caution. They reveal not only what the Romans thought their enemies were like, but also how they wanted them to be remembered. Talking about the average height of a Roman might sound like a simple claim, but in reality, it's more complicated than it seems. The Roman Empire stretched from North Africa to the British Isles, from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the deserts of Syria. With such vast ethnic, geographic, and cultural diversity, speaking of an average Roman is, in many ways, an oversimplification. Still, archaeologists have uncovered clues that help us reconstruct a general picture. One of the most revealing sites has been Herculaneum, a coastal city near modern-day Naples, buried, along with Pompeii, by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Unlike in Pompeii, where many residents managed to escape in time, hundreds of people in Herculaneum sought shelter in stone boathouses by the shore. When a pyroclastic surge swept through the city, they died instantly, but their bones remained sealed beneath meters of volcanic debris, preserved for nearly 2,000 years until they were rediscovered. The remains found there offer a unique window into life and the body of first-century Romans. Among them were rich and poor, men and women, soldiers and civilians, a true microcosm of the empire. For example, one skeleton belonged to a man in his 40s, with an athletic build and muscular arms shaped by regular exercise. He showed no signs of manual labor on his hands, suggesting he belonged to a wealthier class. His height, about 5 feet 9 inches or 175 centimeters, one of the tallest in the group. In contrast, another skeleton, nicknamed the Helmsman, showed signs of childhood malnutrition and bone deformities from a life of hard labor. His height, just 5 feet 4 inches or 163 centimeters. There was also a high-status woman, nicknamed the Lady with the Ring because of the jewelry she wore. She had perfect teeth and a delicate frame. Her height, under 5 feet 2 inches, or about 157 centimeters. And among them, a Roman soldier. His skeleton showed thick bones, marks of old injuries, and a strong build. At nearly 5 feet 9 inches, he was one of the tallest individuals in the group. No coincidence, as soldiers, especially in elite units, were chosen based on physical standards. Altogether, the analysis of the Herculaneum skeletons reveals an average male height of 5 feet 6.5 inches, or roughly 169 centimeters. For women, the average was 5 feet 1 inch, or 155 centimeters. These figures align with findings from Pompeii and other parts of central Italy. The evidence suggests that Roman men were, on average, slightly shorter than many northern populations, but not by a dramatic margin. In fact, coastal cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum may have enjoyed a slight nutritional advantage. Their constant access to fresh fish and seafood provided a stable source of protein, something many inland communities couldn't count on. This may have positively influenced childhood growth. In short, the Romans weren't dwarfs compared to the barbarians. Their height was modest, yes, but not dramatically inferior. And as we'll see later, in the empire, what mattered most wasn't how tall you were, but how strong and resilient you could become. For centuries, the image of the giant barbarian was kept alive by Roman texts. But today, archaeology allows us to compare that image with something more tangible, the actual skeletons that have been unearthed across northern Europe. In the case of Britain, for example, numerous studies have analyzed Iron Age skeletal remains, that is, from populations that lived before or during the early Roman presence. These studies reveal that British men at the time had an average height of around 170 centimeters, or about 5 feet 7 inches. In other words, just 1 inch taller than the men of Herculaneum. In other parts of the north, such as Germany, Denmark, and Ireland, male skeletons typically range between 170 and 175 centimeters in height. It's not a radical difference, just a modest increase compared to the Roman average. But the truly remarkable details lie not in the average, but in the extremes. One of the most striking examples is the Hochdorf chieftain, a tribal leader buried in southern Germany around the 6th century BC. His tomb was an archaeological treasure. It included a massive cauldron of mead, golden ornaments, and remnant of shoes with decorative inlays. His estimated height, over 6 feet, or about 183 centimeters. For his time, that was quite literally enormous. Another fascinating case is the Marlow warlord, an Anglo-Saxon who lived after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. His remains, discovered in England, show a well-fed, muscular man also standing close to 183 centimeters tall. Although from a later period, his physique shows that these physical traits remain prominent among northern elites. And perhaps the most dramatic discovery of all, the so-called Bog Warrior, a Celtic man from the 3rd century BC, perfectly preserved in the dark waters of an Irish peat bog. He stood approximately 2.06 meters tall. That's about 6 feet 9 inches, an extraordinary height even by modern standards. His stomach contained remnants of meat, suggesting a protein-rich diet. His hair was well-groomed, his body strong. Everything about him indicates he belonged to a warrior elite. But these cases do not represent the common folk. They are outliers, leaders, chieftains, elite warriors, individuals who, in addition to good genetics, had access to ample food, rest, and likely a social status that protected them from disease and hard labor. Even so, there's no doubt that many northern peoples had a genetic tendency toward greater height, especially when environmental conditions were favorable. The combination of heredity, climate, lifestyle, and above all, nutrition played a key role in determining how tall someone could grow. And that brings us to a crucial point often left out of military history: diet. Because beyond steel and strategy, the true engine of a strong and tall body begins in childhood on the plate. A person's height is about much more than just inheritance. While genes establish a potential ceiling, whether someone reaches a height depends largely on the environment they grow up in. And in the ancient world, that environment could be extremely unequal. From a genetic standpoint, many northern European peoples already had a natural predisposition to be taller. We can still see this today. Countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and the Nordic nations have some of the highest average statures on Earth. But genetics isn't everything. In antiquity, reaching one's full height potential depended on a childhood free of severe illness, growth without chronic stress, and, above all, a diet rich in protein, healthy fats, and essential micronutrients. And this is where the northern barbarians had a clear advantage. Unlike many Mediterranean regions, where the diet was based on grains, legumes, and wine, northern peoples typically consumed large amounts of red meat, milk, butter, and cheese. Animal husbandry, hunting, and fishing were central to their survival, and provided both the quantity and quality of protein needed to support physical development. Moreover, tribal elites, chieftains, local kings, and elite warriors had first access to the best food. They ate more meat, drank more mead, rested better, and developed larger, stronger, and more resilient bodies. And they were precisely the ones who faced the Romans on the front lines of battle. By contrast, the average Roman, especially outside the elite, had a diet much lower in animal protein. Their food was largely based on grains like wheat and barley, with some legumes, dried fruits, wine, and very little meat, especially among the lower classes. That's not to say the Romans were malnourished, but their diet was less favorable for building tall, robust physiques. To this, we can add other factors: common infectious diseases in crowded cities, hard labor from an early age, and chronic stress, all of which could stunt childhood growth. As a result, even though the genetic differences may not have been significant, the environment made all the difference. The barbarian elite, well-fed, raised in harsh climates, and trained for war, often ended up physically surpassing many of their Roman adversaries. And even if the average height difference wasn't enormous, it was felt on the battlefield, because a Roman standing at 1.68 meters, facing a well-fed, muscular barbarian at 1.85, would definitely feel the difference. And sometimes in war, perception matters just as much as reality. In ancient texts, the battlefield is often portrayed as a place of glory, strategy, and honor, but it was also a brutal physical space where the difference between life and death could come down to the strength of an arm or the advantage of a few extra inches in height. The Roman legions were known for their discipline, their tight formations, and their precision in combat. They didn't rely on brute strength, but on training, coordination, and the ability to endure under pressure. And while their military reputation was feared, that didn't stop Roman soldiers from feeling a certain respect or even fear when facing a barbarian warrior face to face, especially when that enemy was a tribal chieftain, an elite warrior, raised from childhood to fight and fueled by meat, milk, and the blood of battle, a man taller, stronger, and carrying a kind of energy that seemed to defy Roman logic. In theory, recruits of the first cohorts of the legions, the elite units, were supposed to stand at least 5 feet 8 inches tall, or around 173 centimeters. But even among these, height was not the most important factor. What really mattered was physical build, pain tolerance, and the ability to obey without hesitation. Still, in the heat of hand-to-hand combat, size did matter. It wasn't a universal rule, but it was common for Roman soldiers to face barbarian enemies who were slightly taller, and sometimes noticeably so, especially in the front lines, where tribal leaders often fought shoulder to shoulder with their men, setting the example with their imposing presence and overwhelming strength. But this is where Rome made the difference. While the northern peoples relied on physical prowess and individual bravery, the Romans fought as a single body, one shield linked to the next, a spear thrown not on impulse, but on command, a formation that didn't break, even when giants stood before it. In that context, height mattered, but it wasn't everything. What the Romans understood, and what kept them in power for centuries, was that victory didn't come from big bodies alone, but from big systems. And in that, no one could beat them. For centuries, the image of the tall and fearsome barbarian has fueled the imagination of historians, writers, and filmmakers. And while many of those descriptions were born from exaggeration, often driven by Rome's need to glorify its own victories, there's some truth behind them. Northern peoples, shaped by harsh climates, protein-rich diets, and warrior cultures, did tend to be taller and more robust than the average Roman. But the difference, as we've seen, wasn't as dramatic as some accounts would have us believe. The skeletal remains speak of a more nuanced world, where average male height varied by only a few centimeters between Rome and Gaul, between Pompeii and Britannia. What would make a notable difference was access to resources. Tribal leaders, well-fed and physically trained, stood out when compared to common soldiers. And these were often the men Rome faced in the front lines of battle. They're in that narrow space between two shields, between two bodies straining with tension. Height could be intimidating, but Rome endured, and it did so not because its men were taller or stronger, but because they had built a system where discipline outweighed fear and order overcame chaos. So, were the barbarians taller than the Romans? In many cases, yes. Were they giants? No, but to a legionary in the midst of combat, with the sun glinting off an axe raised high above him, the exact measurement might not have mattered, because sometimes what seems bigger is